Welcome everyone to today's presentation, and today I'm going to be continuing the podcast entitled The Tragic Death of Garrett Phillips, A Cry for Justice. And I'm Dr. Silkman from the Foul Play team, and today what I want to specifically do is have a look at the evidence against the state's prime suspect, Nick Hillary. If you haven't seen part 1, have a look at that first and then come back and have a look at part 2. Okay, now in March 2012, there was a huge level of support for Garrett. Now, one's got to understand that at this particular stage, no one had been arrested for Garrett's murder. There was a $40,000 cash reward that had been raised by his supporters, and there were Justice for Garrett signs that were appearing everywhere. Quite clearly, there was a cry for justice, and this was strong in the community and totally understandable. In May 2012, Ian Fairlie, he moved to Buffalo to continue his coaching career. Now, what was interesting was that Justice for Garrett signs started appearing and showing up where Ian was now coaching at. The interesting thing about this was that Ian was the only person that was living in Buffalo who had some connection to the Garrett Phillips case. So was this a form of intimidation? Now remember that investigators wanted him to change his statement. Now for Nick Hillary, he stated it was like being on house arrest. Nick Hillary has 5 children with Dassey Lee, whom he had lived with before dating Tandy. He was at the time unemployed and he took care of the children full time. Because of the notoriety of the case, Nick Hillary had lost his job as a coach, and he was judged as being guilty for murder in the eyes of the public. Now, to stop all of this, to stop all the innuendo, Nick Hillary filed a notice of claim against Potsdam, and specifically he cited injuries and damages sustained during the investigation, false arrest, illegal detention, illegal search and seizure, emotional distress, and defamation. And as we can see here in the pictures, he was photographed totally nude, strip search, and he left the police office in a paper hazmat suit. Now, this is all part of Nick Hillary's civil suit, and the Potsdam Police Department had used the services of Thomas Mortati. So he's the defense attorney for the village of Potsdam. And it's quite clear from what Thomas said. He stated, "I'm going to go after him," of course referring to Nick Hillary. Now let's have a look at some of the DNA evidence, or some of the evidence in this case, and we'll be going over these pieces of evidence quite a number of times. So here's some DNA that was looked at, and I'll quote: "The partial STR DNA profile from the blood-stained cutting from the right sneaker is consistent with DNA from at least one male donor. Due to insufficient genetic information, oral Hillary can neither be included nor excluded as a possible contributor of DNA to this partial STR DNA profile." So the important thing to realize here is that the laboratory did not obtain a full genomic DNA profile, only a partial DNA profile, and the results stated that it can neither be included nor excluded. So hence, the DNA evidence was certainly not conclusive. Now, The current DA at the time, at that particular time, Nicole Duve, stated it remains an open investigation. The New York State Police Crime Lab now orders a second test of Nick Hillary's DNA against the DNA obtained underneath Garrett's fingernail scrapings. In order to do this test, the state used a software program called True Allele, and that particular program found, I quote, no statistical supports for a match. So hence, at this particular stage, there was no definitive forensic evidence to place Nick Hillary at the crime scene that was at 100 Market Street. Now enter Mary Rain. The entire murder of Garrett Phillips now turns political because Mary Rain was a district attorney candidate at the time. And as you can see through these posters for supporting Mary Rain for the new district attorney. So Mary Rain was very, very critical of the current district attorney, and she basically blasted her performance. And Duve basically fought back and said, look, there's simply not enough evidence in order to convict Nick Hillary. Now, what had happened was, when the voting was all done and dusted, Mary Rain became the new district attorney of St. Lawrence County. And as you can see here, she took opportunistic photographs with Tandy Cyrus, the mother of Garrett Phillips. In the meantime, Nicole Duve had sent William Fitzpatrick, who's a district attorney, a summary of the case. Nicole Duve had stated that there wasn't enough evidence in order to convict Nick Hillary. William Fitzpatrick thought otherwise, and he wrote back and he made the comment, why isn't this guy in handcuffs? Well, 5 prosecutors reviewed all of the material from the Garrett Phillips case, photographs, documents, everything. The prosecutors had found no smoking guns in reviewing the case material. However, the focus now was very much on video footage that was obtained from Potsdam High School security cameras. So let's have a look at some of this video evidence. We can see here that Nick Hillary's vehicle had entered the school's car park, that's the Potsdam Central High School car park, at 4:47:33 p.m. It's important to note that at the time, the investigators did not know who the car belonged to, nor the driver. Also captured on video footage, we have Garrett Phillips exiting the school on his ripstick. And this particular image was snapped at 4:51:54 p.m. Also at 4:52:32, we can see that Nick Hillary's vehicle commences to leave the school's car park. At 4:53:06, Nick Hillary's vehicle is seen leaving the school's car park and it turns left. This is the same direction that Garrett Phillips went. So what we've got here is an image of Garrett Phillips, and we also have an image of Nick Hillary's vehicle that has turned left from the car park. From these images, Mark Murray made the statement. He followed Garrett Phillips home that day. From these two images, that's what Mark Murray concluded. Now, Mark Murray actually had no proof of this. He, in actual fact, had speculated. Now remember, Nick Hillary was considered a prime suspect from the get-go. But there's one problem with this. When Mark Murray was questioned, I'll read this out. And the question was, okay, did you hear about the high school video before 10/26/2011? No. So Mark Murray never saw these images, but from day one, Mark Murray had considered Nick Hillary as the prime suspect. Now, Nick Hillary is deposed, and the reason why he wanted to go with his civil suit was, and I quote, Nick Hillary stated, "I've nothing to hide." But if you are deposed in a civil suit, the state can ask any questions that they want. And remember, Thomas Mortati was the defense attorney for the village of Potsdam, and he asked Nick Hillary many questions about his activities on that day. So, on May the 12th, 2014, District Attorney Mary Rain presents evidence to a grand jury to secure an indictment against Nick Hillary for murder in the second degree. And by the way, this is the highest charge for this particular crime, and it carries a sentence of 25 years to life. So what actually is second degree murder? I quote, "Second degree murder is where the unlawful killing of another human being was carried out without any form of planning or premeditation. The defendant may have intended to cause harm, but did not necessarily intend to kill." So, from all of this, 3 days later, the grand jury returns an indictment, and Nick Hillary is arrested. And you can see here Mark Murray holding Nick Hillary, and Nick Hillary kept on saying, I quote, "I'm 100% innocent." So eventually in July 2014, Nick Hillary is released on bail. Now, Nick Hillary spent a total of 70 days in jail. I want to introduce to you a very important alibi witness, Shannon K. Hillary, and she's seen here at Potsdam High School. Shannon K. is Nick's eldest daughter, and she was in high school when she testified in front of the grand jury. So let's have a look at the events of Monday, October the 24th, 2011. This is the unfortunate day that Garrett Phillips was murdered. Now, Shannon Kay stated that when she had arrived home from school at about 4:30 p.m., she saw her father, Nick Hillary. He was at home. Nick had then left for Potsdam High School between 4:35 and 4:40 p.m. to watch a soccer game, and it was raining. And of course, from the video footage, we can actually see Nick Hillary's vehicle, and that was videotaped at 4:47:33. So everything that Shannon Kay had stated is consistent with what we see in the video footage. Now, let's have a look at all of this and sum up what was actually happening. So Garrett Phillips is here. He was snapped at 4:54 p.m. and we can actually see the position of where Garrett Phillips was ripsticking at this position shown here by the black arrow. At 4:52:14 p.m. we can see that another video camera caught Garrett Phillips on his ripstick heading towards Leroy Street. So there's no question that Garrett Phillips at that particular time was heading towards Leroy Street. Now, as it just so happened, there was also a security camera at Canton Potsdam Hospital, and it also captured Garrett Phillips going down Cottage Street on his ripstick, and the time of that was 4:52:59. So we can see that from the time differences, Garrett Phillips went from the school's car park and he was ripsticking down Cottage Street. And we can confirm all of this by security film footage. So there's no question that Garrett Phillips was heading home from school. And we know this because his mother, Tandy, had phoned him and told Garrett to go home and commence his homework. So we can actually timestamp his movement. We know that the last time he was videotaped was Garrett ripsticking down Cottage Street. And as you can see, he lived with his brother and his mother at 100 Market Street, which was literally down the street from Cottage Street. So he lived very, very close to the school. Also note that at 5:08, Marisa Vogel had phoned the police dispatcher because remember, slightly earlier than that, she had heard a noise coming from apartment 4D, and she rang up the police dispatcher because she was very concerned about the noise that she heard. So what we've got here is the following. At 4:53:06, we have Nick Hillary's vehicle leaving the school car park. It turned left on Leroy Street. So the District Attorney Mary Rain summed up the evidence so far as follows. At 4:53 p.m. was the last time that Garrett Phillips was filmed on his ripstick. At 4:53:06, Nick Hillary's vehicle leaves the school car park and turns left. Now, according to the state and according to timing, at approximately 5:06 p.m., Garrett Phillips was likely deceased. So if we have a look at an overview map looking from above, we can see the critical times here, that Nick left the car park at 4:53 p.m. and at 4:53 p.m. we have Garrett who's ripsticking down Cottage Street. The death of Garrett Phillips likely took place at 5:06 p.m. So note, the state attests that Nick Hillary had to get to 100 Market Street, apartment 4D, and murder Garrett Phillips by 5:06 p.m. Now, the big question is this. Where was Nick Hillary? And did anyone see him or his vehicle? As it turned out, yes, there was. Now, you're not going to believe who actually saw Nick Hillary. So Mark Murray was questioned by Tafari, which was the attorney of Nick Hillary. A quote, question, when you say inconsistencies, beside what we previously discussed about whether or not he had been back to Miss Collins' apartment, that's obviously Tandy Cyrus, what other inconsistencies led you to believe Mr. Hillary was responsible? Answer. There were depositions from, it's meant to be from, Brian Phillips, stating that right around the time immediately preceding the homicide that he had seen Mr. Hillary in that direct vicinity of the scene. Deposition from Dale Wright indicating he saw Mr. Hillary in his vehicle right near the homicide scene, and Ian Fairlie confirming in his deposition that Mr. Hillary places himself within approximately 200 to 250 yards from the bedroom window within 5 to 10 minutes of the homicide, led me to at least question his whereabouts, and his involvement potentially in this? Well, Brian Phillips, you've met before. Brian Phillips is Garrett's uncle. Question: where was Mr. Brian Phillips when he saw Mr. Hillary near the homicide scene? Answer: in his vehicle, personal vehicle. Question: and where was Mr. Hillary when he saw Mr. Answer: in his personal vehicle. Question: okay, was Mr. Brian Phillips also near the scene of the homicide when he saw Mr. Hillary? Answer: yes. Question: did you suspect Mr. Brian Phillips of committing the homicide? Answer: no, I did not. Which is very interesting because it raises a couple of very important questions. Who had actually alibied Uncle Brian Phillips? And if you remember during the interrogation of Nick Hillary, Snell states, I question, everybody's a suspect to us. This whole town's a suspect, okay? All these kids are. And interestingly, a Mr. Dale Rice also saw Nick Hillary in his vehicle. Mr. Rice also wasn't considered a suspect. That's very, very interesting that at that particular time period, Uncle Brian Phillips was around the area where the homicide took place. Okay, so let's have a look what happened with Shana K. Hillary. Now remember, she's a crucial alibi witness for her father. Now, Nick Hillary stated that when he went back home, so he left the car park and he went back home, his daughter, Shana K., was present. Now, Nick Hillary was at his Meadow East apartment roughly between 4:55 p.m. to 5:15 p.m. And that's consistent with what we see in the video. So, did Nick Hillary actually have enough time to get back home? And remember the fact that Garrett Phillips was likely murdered at 5:06. This is according to the state. Now, if we have a look at this map, you can see that Nick Hillary lived here in Meadow East apartment, and he stated that he was there between 4:55 p.m. and 5:15 p.m. And you could see from this red marking that Nick Hillary lived very close to the school car park. So it would have only taken him at least maybe 2 or 3 minutes at best to reach the car park. But also note that Nick Hillary was also very close to Ian Fairlie's house as well. Okay, so what happened? Well, in October 2014, the presiding judge, dismisses the indictment against Nick Hillary, citing prosecutorial misconduct. And I quote, District Attorney Mary Rain asked prejudicial questions without a proper foundation to inflame the jury. Asked Nick Hillary's 17-year-old daughter, Shana K., in violation of the attorney-client privilege, to disclose what her lawyer told her, expressed her personal opinion about the evidence and Nick Hillary's guilt, bullied witnesses with improper questions, sometimes asking the same question 13 times, asserted to witnesses that they could not possibly disbelieve the prosecution's proof that the defendant was guilty. So the judge dismissed the indictment. Now, not to be perturbed, Mary Rain released this statement on November the 13th, 2014. And I quote, after considering all the options and after consulting the Phillips and Collins family, District Attorney Mary Rain has determined to re-indict Oral Nicholas Hillary. When considering the option to appeal, DA Rain said, I quote, it can take an additional 18 months before the family received justice, and that is unacceptable, close quote. The process to re-indict will start Monday. So, quite clearly, District Attorney Mary Rain was not going to give up on Nicholas Hillary. So, on February the 2nd, 2015, District Attorney Mary Rain convenes another grand jury, and Nicholas Hillary is indicted for the second time. But we need to consider somebody else. What about Tandy Cyrus's other ex-boyfriend, Deputy Sheriff John Jones? What about him? Well, there is history, important history. And Tandy Cyrus made a formal complaint against her ex-boyfriend John Jones in 2011. And you can see the formal complaint right here. I'm not going to read the whole lot, only some quoted passages. I quote, "I, Tandy Cyrus, write to make a formal complaint against Mr. John E. Jones Jr. of the St. Lawrence County Sheriff's Department. John has been acting in various ways that causes me to fear for the safety of myself and my sons." Another passage. "The final incident, which was clearly demonstrated that John has no intention of quitting his harassing and intimidating behaviors towards me, happened in December of 2010. On the 9th of December 2010, John filed a legal claim against me in the Potsdam Village Court. This claim has requested for me to provide compensation for unpaid utility bills and an airline ticket and accommodation, all of which John is responsible for. With this last incident, it shows that John is willing to abuse and misuse the judicial system to support his personal grudge, that of jealousy." Another passage. "I do feel, however, that my personal well-being and that of my children are in danger because of the recent string of actions which John has carried out. And finally, I'm extremely fearful this pattern of behavior will continue or even escalate unless it is addressed immediately." And you can see here on October 25th, 2011, far from becoming a suspect, he's actually inside the interrogation room shaking hands with Mark Murray. But things get weirder. Nick Hillary, who was dating Tandy Cyrus at the time, also made a formal complaint against Deputy Sheriff John Jones in 2010. I won't read it all out, but just this passage here. Now remember, John Jones was a deputy sheriff. I quote, "Mr. Jones went on to say that if I was sleeping with his ex-girlfriend, he would have, quote, kicked in my door," unquote. Hearing this threat and knowing that I had my young children, 13, 9 and 9 months old, present in my home, I respectfully told Mr. Jones that I did not feel that it was appropriate for an individual who was not acting under the colour of law to be in my home and to make said threats. Okay, so both Tandy Cyrus and Nick Hillary made formal complaints against Deputy Sheriff John Jones. Now, as it turned out, Deputy Sheriff John Jones was questioned. So we got some history here. So it was clear that John Jones had a relationship with Tandy from 2007 to 2010, and that they had actually lived together for almost 3 years. They had broken up. Now, he was questioned what he did on that particular Monday, the day that Garrett Phillips was murdered. He said that he went home around about 5 p.m. and he took the dog for a walk. And we can also see here that John Jones was actually photographed as well. There were 6 photographs taken altogether. But the remarkable thing was this: John Jones did not live far from where Tandy Cyrus did. So if we have a look at this map over here, we can see Cottage Street, Market Street, and this is the house where Deputy Sheriff John Jones lived. This was the property where Tandy Cyrus lived with her 2 children. Now remember, after Tandy broke up with Nick, it was Deputy Sheriff John Jones who found the apartment for Tandy Cyrus and her children. So quite clearly, the distance between both properties was probably about 4 or 5 minutes walk, if that. So both Deputy Sheriff John Jones and Tandy Cyrus lived very close to one another. Okay, we also discover that John Jones had a key to the apartment, to Tandy's apartment, and he brought in that key to the police office, and he brought it in to compare that key to see if Nick Hillary had any keys similar to that one. So John Jones had the ability to get in Tandy's apartment. A buccal swab was taken of John Jones to prepare his genomic DNA, and John Jones was actually photographed. However, the difference was that John Jones was not stripped naked, and he didn't leave the department in a hazmat suit like Nick Hillary did. Tafari, the attorney, questioned Mark Murray. I quote, "Why did you take any pictures of John Jones?" And Mark Murray says, pretty much just to substantiate that we did take pictures of people besides Nick Hillary, and just to rule out the possibility that he had injury consistent with that as well. Because remember, what they were relying on was that the murderer had jumped out of the window, left the apartment through the window. Now, Mark Murray was also questioned. I quote, "What's the biggest factor connecting Mr. Hillary to this homicide?" Answer, his disdain for Garrett Phillips. Question, do you have any information that Mr. Hillary's fingerprints match the prints that were recovered? Answered, not. The latent prints didn't seem to match with anyone that we've tested so far. Well, the police chief was questioned as well. Question, since 1990, have you ever witnessed or heard of anyone being photographed nude at the Potsdam Police Department? Answer, no. And as you can see here, Nick Hillary was stripped naked and photographed, including his genitals. This did not take place to John Jones. Let's have a look at the forensic evidence again. So, we're now looking at fingerprints. There's no questions that there were prints found at the window. This is the window that the window frame was bent out. I quote, "Police tested 4 lifts of fingerprints that were found at the scene against prints of 40 people who could have had access to the apartment. None match, including Nick Hillary's." Not to be perturbed by that. District Attorney Fitzpatrick now wants to do further DNA testing, but he wants to actually use what is known as forensic software tools. Now, this is using a computer and computer algorithms in order to examine DNA data. Now, they had initially used a program called True Allele, right? So what True Allele does, it's a computer program and it looks at partial DNA data. It did not find a statistical match to Nick Hillary. However, now the District Attorney Fitzpatrick, who represents the state, he wants to submit new DNA evidence. So we know that they took samples from underneath Garrett Phillips' fingernails, and they did a DNA prep, and they wanted to find out, was Nick Hillary's DNA present underneath Garrett Phillips' fingernails? So William Fitzpatrick, he orders another analysis of the DNA results, this time using a software called STR-Mix. Now, the DNA that was found underneath the fingernail scrapings from Garrett Phillips was actually from Garrett Phillips himself and an unknown partial DNA profile. Let me re-emphasize that. It was an unknown partial DNA profile. In other words, they did not obtain a full genomic profile of another individual. They got some alleles, they didn't know who it belonged to, and it was a partial DNA profile. So with a partial DNA profile, you don't have a full genomic DNA profile. So hence, in essence, you're guessing. And what William Fitzpatrick wanted to do was to use a computer program in order to find some type of statistical association of those partial DNA alleles to the genomic DNA profile of Nick Hillary. Okay, so what the judge does, he holds a pre-trial hearing to assess the admissibility of the new DNA report. And I quote, "In determining the motions herein, the court is reminded that," quote, "forensic DNA analysis should be governed by the highest standards of scientific rigor in analysis and interpretation. Neither the STR-Mix nor the RMP results may be used in this case." And RMP is random match probability. So, I quote, "While STR-Mix has been accepted in several states since 2015, Judge Felix Katina rules that the STR-Mix report is not admissible in this case because the sample size is so small and that the lab that handled the DNA was not an STR-Mix validated facility." Now, of course, this caused a lot of confusion in the community, and many people felt that underneath the fingernails of Garrett Phillips was the full genomic DNA profile belonging to Nick Hillary. That was far from the truth. They had a full genomic DNA profile belonging to Garrett Phillips, and they only had alleles from an unknown donor. What the district attorneys were trying to do, the state's district attorneys were trying to do, was to find some type of statistical association of those alleles to Nick Hillary. They certainly did not have another full genomic DNA profile. And when you think about it, had there been the full genomic DNA profile underneath Nick Hillary's fingernails, Nick Hillary would have been arrested for sure. Okay, just to correct a small little error, of course, they were looking for Nick Hillary's DNA underneath the fingernails of Garrett Phillips. Okay, so Nick Hillary decided to change his mind. The courts had selected a group of jurors, but now Nick Hillary decided he wanted to request a bench trial, and that meant there was no jury. So in other words, the judge himself, Judge Katina, he would hear all the evidence and then make a decision himself on the case. And the actual trial began on September the 12th, 2016. Now, the important thing to realize here, and Judge Katina stated it, to the evidence in this case. So Judge Katina was having a look at all the evidence that the state had put in front of him. Now we've had two teams here. The prosecution team that was made up of District Attorney William Fitzpatrick and District Attorney Mary Rain. We have the defense team comprising of Earl Ward, Norm Siegel, and Peter Dumas. Now, let's review the circumstantial evidence against Nick Hillary. So what we have here is a snapshot of Garrett Phillips, who's leaving the car park on his ripstick, and this was captured at 4:52:14 p.m. At 4:53:06 p.m., we have Nick Hillary, who leaves the car park onto Leroy Street, and he turned left onto Leroy Street. We've also got the injury, the ankle injury to Nick Hillary. Now the question is, was this enough to indict Nick Hillary for second-degree murder? Okay, now there are specific issues with the evidence against Nick Hillary. So if we have a look at Nick Hillary leaving the car park where he turns left, no one sees Nick Hillary or his car stopping at or leaving from 100 Market Street. There's no DNA, fingerprint, hair, or fiber evidence that places Nick Hillary at the crime scene of 100 Market Street. Nick Hillary has two alibi witnesses, his daughter, Shannon Kay, and Ian Fairlie. And not forgetting that when Officer Wentworth arrived at 100 Market Street, he knocked on the door, and at 5:24 p.m. he actually hears noises like movement coming from inside the apartment at 4:24 p.m. But that was not the end of it. The prosecution had a star witness by the name of Andrew Carranza. Now remember, both Andrew and his girlfriend Shannon, they were changing a flat tire literally behind the apartment. They were underneath the window that was later found to be pushed out. A private investigator for the defense team, Don Tracy, had phoned up Andrew. And Andrew told Don by phone, I quote, "Well, I saw a black guy on the second floor, a silhouette of somebody that fits Nick's." So that was potentially very damaging information against Nick Hillary. However, when Shannon Harris and her boyfriend at the time, Andrew Carranza, when they were initially interviewed by the police, they were specifically asked if they had seen anyone in the window and any movement, and both had said no. And this was confirmed by their police statements. All of a sudden, Andrew Carranza had changed his story many years later. So the private investigator went to the crime scene, and he stood outside and he looked up at the window and exactly stood in the spot where the car park was, where the car had their tire being changed. And you can see on the diagram on the right hand side that they were very close to underneath the window. Now, so both Shannon Harris and Andrew Carranza were in a prime position to see if anyone had jumped from the second floor window. So Shannon Harris had heard about what her I think ex-boyfriend was going to do. So Shannon Harris phones up Andrew Carranza, and Andrew says to Shannon, I quote, "I could see the person, but couldn't make out the person because he was so fucking black," end quote. Andrew Carranza also said, "I couldn't fucking see who it was." So what was very interesting was that when Andrew Carranza came to testify in front of the judge, I quote, "On the stand, Andrew Carranza testified that he saw a figure peeking out the window, but DA William Fitzpatrick did not ask him for a description. And I wonder why, because in Andrew's original deposition, he didn't see anyone. Okay, but to make matters worse and very interesting, the prosecutors withheld potential exculpatory evidence. And I quote, this is Dumas, an individual by the name of Gregory Brown, in looking at it, may be favourable to the defendant. So when the prosecutors hold back potentially exculpatory evidence, this is a clear-cut Brady violation. So a statement from Gregory Brown was obtained, and in the report he said some very interesting and damaging statements. I quote, this is Gregory Brown. Jones got out of the truck and walked into the Brown house, which was part of the apartment complex. Brown believed that Jones was the killer, but he never mentioned that to Jones. Brown said he can't believe that a black man could kill someone in Potsdam, New York, and jump out of a second-story window without having someone see him. Now remember, no one had seen an African-American male enter or leave apartment 4D at 100 Market Street. Now it just so happened that both Gregory Brown and John Jones knew each other. They'd played football together many years ago. So the state had obviously forgot to tell the defense team about the witness who had seen John Jones walk into the apartment. So the defense team go and interview Gregory Brown. However, the defense team decided against calling Gregory Brown to testify as a witness. The defense had asked Judge Felix Katina for a dismissal due to a Brady violation. The judge declined. So what about the veracity of Gregory Brown's statement? Well, believe it or not, there's a camera on the side of Canton Potsdam Hospital in the car park, and it faces directly to John Jones' house. And at 5:07:13 p.m., John Jones was allegedly walking his dog. So that's a clear alibi for John Jones that he couldn't have been at the apartment 4D murdering Garrett Phillips. But it gets more bizarre than that. Prior to that, at 4:52:05 p.m., the camera captures John Jones coming home in his truck. At 4:52:36, the camera now picks up Garrett Phillips riding on his ripstick and going straight past John Jones' house. So John Jones was asked by the district attorney, I quote, "Did you see Garrett Phillips ripsticking down Cottage Street on the afternoon of October the 24th? And Jones replied, "No, I did not." And that's very interesting because Nick Hillary also stated that when he was in the car park, he was unaware that Garrett Phillips had left the school. On September the 28th, 2016, the judge now reaches a verdict. And that verdict was not guilty of murder in the second degree. And as you can see, really, there's no jubilation. It's a terrible sensation for all parties involved. So Judge Katina stated, and I quote, "The case against the defendant is entirely based upon circumstantial evidence. Because of this, the court must review the evidence in this case under a rigorous standard." Let's have a look at the aftermath. This is after the trial and the finding. Nick Hillary filed a second civil rights lawsuit against the village of Potsdam, and the case is pending. This is at the time when the documentary was made. Tandy Cyrus raises money for after-school programs in Garrett's memory. And in June 2018, Mary Rain was barred from practicing law in New York for a period of 2 years for, I quote, severe and persistent misconduct. In March 2019, the new district attorney, Gary Pasqua, said police were reviewing new leads in the Garrett Phillips murder investigation, which is considered an ongoing case. And here we have, of course, the tragic death of Garrett Phillips. So let's sum this up now that we've reviewed a lot of the crime scene footage, including the videos from the various cameras. So this is the layout showing Leroy Street, Cottage Street, and Market Street. Now we know that Garrett Phillips was videotaped at 4:52:14 p.m. on his ripstick in the car park. We know that at 4:52:59, Garrett Phillips was photographed near the Campton Potsdam Hospital, riding on his ripstick. We know the direction that Garrett Phillips was going on. He clearly was going to his home at 100 Market Street. We know that at 4:53:06, Nick Hillary turns left on Leroy Street. Sheriff Deputy John Jones' house is right here, and Garrett Phillips rides right past Deputy Sheriff John Jones' home. Deputy Sheriff John Jones said he never saw Garrett Phillips. Close to John Jones was Ian Fairlie's house, and according to Ian Fairlie, he saw Nick come in at about 5:21 p.m. and that's confirmed because Nick had a phone call, and Ian stated that Nick Hillary wasn't sweating, it was normal, and they were going to have a meeting in regards to a soccer player. At 100 Market Street, of course, we have Tandy Cyrus's apartment. And remember, Officer Wentworth hears movement at 5:24. And quite clearly, Nick Hillary cannot be at two places at once. And both of them have alibis to place them at different places rather than 100 Market Street where the murder took place. It's very interesting because no one sees anyone coming out of a window at 5:20. So how was Nick Hillary meant to have gone to 100 Market Street, hid in there, and no one saw him come in, no one saw him leave, and yet at 5:21 he's now seen at Ian Fairlie's house. And again, Shannon and Andrew, who were repairing or replacing a flat tire on the car, were directly underneath the window, and they never saw anyone coming out at 5:20 p.m. So it is indeed a mystery. Okay. The larger question is, why were both men treated differently? So when you think about it, at a very early stage of the investigation, both Nick Hillary and John Jones, who are both ex-boyfriends of Tandy Cyrus, they should have been treated as potential suspects. And in actual fact, you need to include Brian Phillips, because Uncle Brian Phillips was also very close to the murder scene. But as one can see here, Nick Hillary was definitely treated very, very different to John Jones. Now, John Jones happened to be a law enforcement officer, but like Nick Hillary, he was an ex-boyfriend of Tandy Cyrus. So we come to the conclusion of my presentation. Who killed 12-year-old Garrett Phillips? Now remember, I'm not an expert on this case, and I haven't seen all the documentation. My aim is to try and get the primary court material so I can have a look at the testimonies and the forensic evidence. So the question is, from what we've seen so far. Did Nick Hillary kill Garrett Phillips? Did Deputy Sheriff John Jones kill Garrett Phillips? My conclusion is simple. Neither of them did. Because what applied to Nick Hillary in terms of circumstantial evidence also equally applied to Deputy Sheriff John Jones. Both Nick Hillary and Deputy Sheriff John Jones, they had alibis for being elsewhere at the time. But I want to leave you with this, and this is very, very intriguing. Who did Gregory Brown see walking into the apartment complex? It clearly couldn't have been Deputy Sheriff John Jones. But as you can see, John Jones is white. So, my conclusion, and it's not a good one, the killer of Garrett Phillips is still out there, guys. Still out there. So, if you've enjoyed the podcast, please consider subscribing and supporting the channel. My name is Dr. Silkman, and I'm from the Foul Play team. Thank you very much.